Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. And hello, Jane. It's really awesome to see you again.
Hello, Andrew. Likewise, it's great to be back.
Yeah, fantastic. And we've been looking forward to this one, haven't we? Because our film today, actually, I won't do a drum roll because my computer's very sensitive and will probably switch off or something. We are going back to the high point of 1980s, 1990s filmmaking, and we are going to be talking about Memphis Belle,
Yep.
the story of the Second World War US heavy bomber whose crew was the first to complete their 25 mission tour of duty. And what an amazing film it was.
Yeah. Oh, so true. We are going on board a B-17, aren't we? And there will be mentions of the war, by the way, just as pre-warning. We will don't mention the war. We will mention the war. It comes with the territory on this film, but it's a fantastic movie, and it's a fantastic bit of storytelling. It's sort of partly fictional, but it does have its root in a very brutal reality.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. I like the approach they took, in fact, because they could have done a straight film about the real crew of the Memphis Belle, but this gave them an opportunity, I felt, and they took it. They did very well to paint a broader canvas of the war in the air, as you say, Jane. And yeah, it's true. When you look at the characters' names for one thing, none of them are the real crew of the Memphis Belle. I think there's been some very loose interpretation there, but they're a great cast of characters. And of course, with the things that happen to the bomber over the course of this last mission in the film, in a very it's not a well-worn approach, but it's been used successfully elsewhere. They take certain incidents that happened to a load of other bombers and then pile them on the unfortunate Memphis Belle, who really does look a state by the time she comes home. So
Yeah.
it's
True. But I also like how they actually they give us a glimpse into the different personalities of the crew, which is really good because you do feel for them as a viewer, and you really start to feel you know each one of them. There is the poet, that's the quiet one, that's the one always boasting and that kind of thing. And there is this very, very young captain who carries all the responsibilities on his very young shoulders, and we do get that little glimpse into their different personalities, which I think really carries the movie as well.
Yes, and I really love how they dealt with because 10 characters is a lot of people to follow right from the start of the film. I love the monologue they start with, where John Lithgow's character, the Major Derringer, he is sort of mentally assessing each one, goes, oh, there's always an Irish one, oh, there's always a religious one. And it's fantastic because without that, I would have struggled
Yeah.
to sort of fix who's who in my mind.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
um,
That's a good point. It's a very good starting sequence, that one. And you also and this is actually the amazing thing, you also get the impression of what's actually happening back at base all the time. You have the technicians on the floor, you also have the commanders, and you have this slightly uh, uh, well, a bit too much sort of reporter who just want to celebrate and kind of have that side of it, and who thinks the commander is just boring and he doesn't really care about anything. And so you get these different characters that holds it all together in a really, really nice way. And then in their own sort of little world on board the plane, you have the crew doing their own thing, and having their sort of internal dynamics there. Some of them obviously closer to one another than others, but all of them having a function, all of them depending on each other.
yes, they very much formed a bit of a family, haven't they?
Yeah.
And and actually their family in the context of that conflict is quite a unique one, because the thing I find truly horrific is, and the film brings it home without overstating it, is that now they don't actually say this, but of course the Eighth Air Force began its offensive against Germany in 1942.
Yeah.
And we're now in May 1943, and it's very telling that no crew as a coherent unit has been through 25 missions. Now, the majority of the time, a bomber would come back with one or two dead or one or two too badly wounded. But the really awful psychological impact of that, of course, is that you've kind of formed this family at the outset, and members of it keep dying or
Yeah.
changing. So it's such a precious thing by the time they set out on their 25th mission that they've got all this this as you say, this emotional bond behind them. And even if they don't always get on, and of course they don't, that really strong brotherly almost connection is very much there.
And
Um,
so true. And it was, I think actually it takes a little while before we get to that final mission and they actually get in the air. And I think that was actually brilliant as well as part of the storytelling, because you have this party going on and you get to know a lot about them during that. You know, they each have their own strategy for coping. You know, the one who gets really drunk and you know, some of them try to score the girls, and you know, there's a variety of ways to try and function and get through this. And that's actually a really good sort of glimpse into partly different mentalities, but also different ways of coping with this absolutely horrible situation.
Yes, and as you said earlier, they are all so young.
Yeah,
When I first watched the film in 1991, as a child, I thought, wow, these guys. You know, when I thought about it, it's like, oh, they're all grown-ups. I watch the film now, and I just think, oh my God, these poor children. You know, and they are really. Uh,
yeah,
to think that at the age of 19, for a lot of them, you'd be standing in a bomber at a machine gun, having to fight for your life. And also, if you're one of the crewmen who had another duty as well as manning a machine gun, having to focus on that. I really don't know if my 19-year-old self would have stepped up to do that. It's
and I think maybe a lot of the times they didn't. I think a lot of the time you followed along because that was what you could do. You didn't really have much control of what was happening. You would you were given a task, you were given a position, you got training in how to do that, and then off you went. You know,
yes.
and then also you know, that poor captain who sits there, and he's what is he, 22? I think we get to know
He's
he's
22,
he's a
yeah.
kid, you know, and he sits there with that responsibility. It's when you think about it, it's insane.
Yeah, yeah, and he's representative of so many. I mean, I really like what's his name? It's Dearborn. Yeah, the character's
Yes,
Captain Dearborn. His character is so incredible because
yes,
the way his crew act up sometimes, it's a real wonderful reminder that they really are just overgrown
yeah,
boys in many respects. And you get Phil, the difficult co-pilot, who secretly thinks he should have been captain, really. It's only when he makes his own mistakes
yeah,
and actually sees Dennis Dearborn do his thing and save
yeah,
them a couple of times. You think actually
yeah.
he's an annoying dad, but he does know what he's doing.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, I do love the moment when I mean, because of course it's such a long journey for these guys to the target, and you get the conversation where they try and lighten the mood a bit, and Dearborn says, "Oh, you know, when it's all over, you come and work for my family furniture business." Just the silence. Like I said, don't give it a thought.
There. But you know, in a way, that little funny as it is, but that little sort of dialogue there also says a lot, because he has had to take on this responsibility. So in a way, he has to be the boring dad, you know, who he has to be the responsible one. And maybe that's not how he would have turned out had he been allowed to be a normal 22-year-old, you know. But he kind of had to take that role on in a way, and even that role of, you know, it's all right, dad will work it out kind of role, you know, whenever they got into any kind of trouble. So in a way, you feel for him as well, because he had to become that character
Yeah.
that takes on that slightly boring personality.
Yeah, and he very seldom, I think, lets the mask slip
Oh, true.
throughout the film. There's a couple of moments like when he's talking to the bomber and also kind of half to his sweetheart the night before the mission. Um, and at the party where he can't really get anyone to talk to him much,
Yeah.
there's that. It does highlight that loneliness of his
Yes.
position, I think. And but in action, he is incredible. I love that contrast between him and Phil when they're forming up and they
Yes.
nearly have that collision with the other bomber.
Yeah.
And Phil goes, "Oh my God," and ducks,
Yeah.
which you're not supposed to do when you're one of the pilot. And Captain Dearborn just sort of
Yeah.
goes, okay, bad, and just does something and
Yeah.
maneuvers them
Yeah.
apart. And
That says a lot, and you get that so early on. That little scene there, that you kind of have the two characters there. You got the picture of them in that very moment.
yes, yeah,
And also, I think this thing about, he just really, really want to fire a shot. So he kind of arranges to go at the back, and when he realizes, okay, maybe that wasn't the cleverest thing I could have asked for. But it does display that boyishness. I cannot go back without having fired a single shot.
yes, yes. And in fact, the very earthy way he puts it, like, what girl's going to want to hang out with me if I haven't killed a single Nazi?
Yes. Oh, yeah, and that speaks into that little, the young boyish kind of thing as well. Um, but I was also thinking, Andrew, actually watching through this again, because you know a lot more about this than I do. But when we look at the aerial side of warfare and just how massive this was, especially during the war, there was a huge psychological aspect of this type of warfare as well, because you couldn't really see them coming until it was too late. And there was such a massive amount of destruction coming from these bombing airplanes. There were
Yeah.
lots of civilian losses as well in this. This must have turned the psychological fear of the war upside down for a lot of people.
Yes, the war actually surprised a lot of people because prior to the war, and the attitudes are reflected in a lot of the film's dialogue, there was this belief among the people who were arguing for air power being the primary determinant of war in the future, that you could almost win wars by aerial bombardment alone. And I mean, it was a nice idea. Because although it was horrific, their theory was that if you can flatten an enemy's cities, they'll surrender overnight and nobody will have to go through a World War One style lengthy conflict anymore. And there were people in Britain, in the United States, in Italy and Germany who believed this. Um, However, curiously enough, the experience of war painted a very different picture. And horrible though it sounds, civilian resilience to bombing proved remarkable. There were many people whose lives and minds were shattered by aerial bombing, but there were so many surprises as well. The Blitz didn't drive Britain to surrender, and the Allied bombing of German cities. It helped slow down their industrial production a bit, but there was never a danger that the bombing on its own, as we know now, was ever going to bring Germany to surrender. But the psychological output was very interesting because a lot of Germans recollected later that it was something that happened. They were terrified. They had no control over it. But a great deal of them just carried on because they either had no alternative under the Nazi regime or they simply didn't know what else to do. So when some of them, almost risk their lives trying to get to their factories, only to find their factories have been badly damaged and need a bit of a rebuild before they can get them going again. It's almost a habit and an attempt to reassert the normalcy that you knew on
Yes.
top of the destruction that's been continuously visited on you. I did want to hold the film up a little bit about the business of bombing accuracy because it's very high-minded what they say, oh, there's a children's playground over here, there's a school over there. Um, so the Norden bomb site, this very cool bit of kit that Lieutenant Val Kolovsky is playing with as he got, it was arguably the most accurate bomb site developed during the Second World War.
Okay.
But we need to put that into a context, because certainly in this day and age, when we say 100% accuracy, we expect it to be 100% accuracy. The developers of the Norden argued before the war that it would give you perfect accuracy. It unfortunately failed to do that for reasons which are completely understandable with the conditions and the limits of technology at the time. But by 1943, an accurate raid was regarded as 30% of your bombs landing within 1,000 yards of the aiming point.
Okay.
That would be put down as a successful mission with most of your ordnance on target. So, with all due respect to the crew of the Memphis Belle and the rest of the bomber wing, that accurate bombing probably would have knocked out the factories they were aiming at, but it would inevitably have destroyed the
Yeah.
playground and all the
Yes.
buildings around it as well.
That's
It,
not that's kind of an important detail, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, but to give them their due, until they realized that it wasn't, that level of accuracy was just not attainable. The United States Army Air Force did make strenuous efforts to do it cleanly, if
Mm.
I can put it that way. So there was a big debate between them and the Royal Air Force at the time, and the United States believed in
Yes.
precision bombing. Whereas the Royal Air Force had a more indiscriminate approach, which was to bomb at night and just
Yes.
flatten the city center. Now, the morally reprehensible though it is to us today, that from a tactical and a logistical perspective, you could argue the Royal Air Force was right,
Mm.
because the level of accuracy the United States Army Air Force wanted was just not something they could achieve.
Mm.
So if you're going to do that level of damage to a city center anyway, you might as well attack at night when you'll suffer fewer losses, because
Yes. Yes. That's a poignant but very true point. Yes.
there's no nice way to say it, I'm afraid, because it represents a very, very grim and cold-blooded calculus. Because of course, the other thing the Allies are worried about, as Memphis Belle really brings out, is that you've got these highly trained guys in very expensive aircraft, and every time you lose one, it's a major blow, and you have to make sure that you're producing enough to keep up
Yes.
your strength. And so anything you can do to preserve your planes and the crews is something that you ought to do. But
That
yeah, no, not nice for anybody involved, I don't think.
Oh, that's really interesting, Andrew. But you're also right in this. I mean, because when you are a bomber, you never really look your enemy in the eye, because you never really see them. You just drop a bomb. Uh, but there are moments when they are so close to some of the fighters that they can see the pilots. You know, they can see bits of the crew. And actually, I did like that bit. You know, that you actually gets at some point so close that you can actually see there's a human being sitting in there, someone like me, probably another young boy.
Yes, yes, and it was a bad time. It was certainly a bad time for the Luftwaffe, because with the tide of war beginning to change in the spring of 1943, you find that the Luftwaffe pilots, like everyone else's pilots, they're starting to be younger and younger faces in the ranks and the
Yeah.
training programs,
Yeah.
um, and of course, the Germans also have to worry about the Soviet Union. So a lot of their most experienced pilots are being sent off to the Eastern Front, which means even more inexperienced
Mm.
pilots coming in. But Memphis Belle is set at an interesting tipping point, because from about the end of 1942 to the spring of 1943, there existed a rather weird parity between the US Air Force and the Luftwaffe. They neither side had a clear advantage, and they were both still trying to figure out tactics that would defeat the other, and trying to get the measure of their opponents, really. Um, and it probably shows in a lot of the dialogue in the film, where they I mean, of course, we don't get the German perspective. They're completely silent participants, but But you can imagine. I think if I was a fighter pilot going in on a big bomber formation, and of course there would have been hundreds of
Yeah,
B-17s. There's something quite intimidating about it because it's a bit of an old joke about how everything's bigger and certainly larger if it comes out of the United States. But these were larger bombers than anything the Germans built, or at least in quantity. And they were much more heavily armed than anything that the Germans produced. So, these planes can bite back. They don't duck very well, but they have an awful lot of teeth. And one of the horrific realizations German pilots came to very quickly was that approaching a B-17 from behind was a really bad idea because a
yeah,
lot of the plane's defensive armament covers
yes.
that arc.
That is true, actually. That is true. And we do get that impression as well in some of the fight scenes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yes, and of course they talk to each other. There's that
yeah,
continuous chatter of so and so coming in at 3 o'clock, tail gunner, get him if you can. So for the period, for the 1940s, it's a very well coordinated
yeah.
defensive system. Still doesn't stop them suffering heavy losses, but it's
Mm.
better than the setup a lot of other nations have. Um, and then, of course, Captain Dearborn breaks in as dad should every now and then, saying, "You don't have to shout over the intercom."
Yes, fair enough. But you do get that sense as well, because that's one point when there's one coming in at the front, and I think it's the co-pilot who said, "What am I to do? Spit on him?"
Yes, yeah.
Sitting there defenseless, at the front, not really being able to do anything. But you do get the impression of how the plane works as well, which is actually done really well. It's done really, really well. Oh, there's so many things there, Andrew. But yeah, you mentioned there about accuracy. And I kind of wanted to ask you this as well, because we kind of know about the importance of flak, for example, as a way of obscuring things. What kind of role, because I want to ask you that as well, what kind of role was that effective enough, or was it as we see in the film? How did that actually work?
Okay, so flak actually was not a very effective way of shooting down aircraft because at those distances, even with aiming devices, and the Germans did have some quite sophisticated ones, but it's very hard to land an individual shell from an individual gun where you want it. And of course, with B-17s flying at more than 20,000 feet altitude, it's really difficult to target them. So what most countries around the world had decided to do with their heavy flak, and you see it with in the film, is they would instead allocate each gun battery a particular patch of the sky, and the gunners would be told, make sure that bit of sky is full of lead and exploding shells so that any bomber approaching the city from that direction has to fly through it. And we just hope that it hits them.
Yeah,
Of course, the one thing that I liked that the film did is it just shows you how dangerous even near misses would be, and the planes constantly shuddering around and bits of shrapnel tearing through the fuselage. So it was a very discomforting experience for the bomber crews, and frequently quite lethal for individuals aboard the
yeah,
planes. And even if you weren't directly hit, the buffeting could throw your aim off a bit
yes,
at the point
yes,
of release. So in a sense, the anti-aircraft guns are very much a sort of passive defense, but they have the ability to hurt the bombers. The other German defenses, like when Val complains that he can't see the target and he thinks
yes,
that smoke projectors, the Germans went for smoke projectors an
yeah,
awful lot. So basically, nothing fancy about these lorries filled with combustible material that would drive up to the threatened spot, and they would just pull the stops or set light to this stuff, and you get a massive smoke screen. Um, Now, in a sense, that I personally think smoke screens are tempting fate a bit, because if the bombers above you get fed up trying to find their target, they're just going to
yeah.
indiscriminately release their bombs and
That
then
is
go
true.
home.
That is true.
Um, so you may not be doing yourself a favor with
Yeah,
smoke
no,
screens.
that is true. Actually, that is true. But I thought the the display of sort of the use of flag in the film was actually good, because I remember watching this in my late teenage years, and I didn't know that was how flag worked at the time. I remember I was actually quite impressed by how they'd portrayed that, because I thought it was just sort of smoke and you can just go through it. But as you say, the entire plane was shaking and they could get hit, you know, you were always a little afraid of it. So in a way, I thought that was actually brilliantly done, because this was certainly not without danger going through, you know, an area of flag.
Yes, the journey of a bomber to any given target was always quite a nasty one, because you'd encounter all these layers of defenses. So if the Germans were feeling very enterprising, they would sometimes have small penny packets of fighters over the Channel and the North Sea. And the idea behind those was that if the Allies weren't paying attention, because they, oh, we haven't even reached continental Europe yet, you could pick off one or two bombers that were being
Yes.
inattentive. And then, of course, once they cross over into German-controlled territory, you get these steady interceptions by whole squadrons of fighters. And if your route takes you over any other cities, which you sometimes do for navigational purposes, then of course the gun batteries down there are more than happy to fire at you,
Yeah.
even if that city is not the target. So you've got this long, awful journey, most of it spent over hostile territory. And again, the B-17 is not designed for crazy maneuvers. And even more so than the Royal Air Force, the US believed in these really tight, rigid formations.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, they did that for bomb accuracy, and also so the guns of each bomber could mutually support one another. And there was something to the theory, but it also meant you were terribly vulnerable.
Yes, because you also, and we do see this as well, you were also in danger of actually hitting each other, weren't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Accidents, I'm sorry to say, were very common in these rigid formations. And while you might sometimes be grateful for clouds if they hid you from enemy planes, it also sets you up for a possible collision if someone's
Yeah.
not where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have this new crew on a new plane, and we do get to see them a little bit, and they're very nervous, and they have their very first flight, and of course it goes wrong. Um, and then you have this almost like a game, you know, what are the odds of this and that happening? And I saw two parachutes, you know, and that's kind of how that is, you know, you okay, maybe two of them survived. So there's this constant sort of psychological count going on, you know, as well, in the plane
Yeah.
still remaining in the air.
Well, you very rightly mentioned coping strategies earlier, and I think calculating the odds was one of them. And it does explain why so many of these guys ended up being obsessive gamblers in their
Yeah.
spare time, because your whole existence was a gamble of sorts, and you suddenly became very interested in statistics, whether you
Yes.
wanted to or not. Um, yes, another thing that brings it home to me is between the effects of losses, and in a way you kind of shut down your memory outside your crew as a way of coping. After one of, I think it's one, yes, earlier in the mission, one of the bombers goes down, and they all share that joke that one of the gunners
Yes.
showed them, and then they're like, no, can't remember his name, can see his face,
Yeah.
can't, but it
Yeah.
was a good joke. And
Yes. Yeah, true, true. And there is something about maybe not knowing him that's kind of a coping mechanism as well, you know.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Don't get too friendly, because it would
yes.
just be a bit too painful if
Yes.
when they're lost.
And we do get a mention of that in the Yeats poem too, that, you know, it's my family and not my family, in that. So that the use of that poem is it's really good too. And then of course you have back on the ground, you have the really poignant psychological insight in that scene with the letters,
Oh, yes.
which I thought was really well done as well, because at the end of that, you have that poor commander sitting there, uh, trying to get his boys home, and at the same time, the one who has to write the letters back to the family.
Yes, that is the ultimate loneliness of command, I think. The because there are some who might think, well, it's all right for you. You have an office job, Colonel Harriman, and I think Derringer actually says to him, you're
Yes.
only interested in results and
Yeah.
brown-nosing HQ. But actually, to my mind, there's nothing more horrific for someone than having to send these guys out on your authority. There's the horrendous situation where you're caught having to be the guy who sends all these poor boys out, knowing that you'll never get
Yeah.
all of them back. And then you also face the emotional consequences of that because as you said, you're the one who has to write the letters to their families explaining what's become of them. And it's not a situation I would ever what nobody would want to be in that situation, I think. And that scene with the letters is beautiful because to me it balances the perspectives between the two men. So you see more you see Colonel Harriman crack when he goes, look what I have to do, look what I have to deal with. And I think the way he doesn't say anything, but the way Lithgow reacts, his character reacts, I think he does begin to
Yeah.
understand the Colonel. In a weird way, I kind of understand him as well. It's very easy to paint someone like him as
Yes.
an out and out bad guy. Oh, you're just interested in publicity. It's what, you're just using these poor kids. But then it spoke very subtly to me about the need to keep the population back home invested in the conflict.
Yes.
Yeah, because if as they genuinely seem to believe that the aerial offensive is going to win the war,
Yeah.
but they've already suffered such grievous losses, you need to get the nation to get behind it and go, yes, we are going to be, not exactly happy about it, but we will supply more sons and husbands and brothers to
Yeah.
replace the ones who've already been lost if it means winning the war.
Yeah.
So he has a difficult job as well. It's just he goes about it in a way that makes him quite unlikable in the film.
Yes, but actually that scene is, I think, from a storytelling perspective, done really well because you hear the different voices reading the letters. So from a wife, from a father, from a brother, and so on. So you hear different voices reading bits and fragments of letters, and you just see him, as you say, you just see him sitting there, and he doesn't say anything, but he's sort of looking up with this sort of a little hopeless look in his face as you
Mhm.
realize he's beginning to understand.
Absolutely, yes. And those voices are, I feel, the most important ones in that
Yes.
scene because the folks back home get a sort of secondary voice through
Yeah.
the dialogue of the main characters, but that's the only bit in the film where you actually hear any of them, and
Yeah.
it's so, so important. I think that scene was beautifully placed. I think it would have been a much, much weaker film
Yeah.
without it, or some kind of an equivalent to it.
Yeah. No, that was massive. And then I also, again, from a psychological perspective, I like how we get to see they all of them have this little bit of superstition with them. You have something with you, like whether it's something around your arm or something you carry, whatever it is, you have that little bit of hope with you all the time. That sort of speaks volumes as well, because for all their boyish banter and that kind of thing, you have something they all hold on to.
Yes, yes, superstition is a big thing, and I don't know if anyone does it in the film. I don't think they do. It would, as you say, it would either be a talisman of some kind, or some men found that if they told themselves that if they'd been on a successful mission, if you did precisely the same routine you had
Yes.
followed before that mission, then you'd be fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, they set so much store by these
Yeah.
things, don't they? And when they're going through
Yes.
the trunk of the guy who didn't come back for a previous mission, like, oh look, he forgot his lucky charm. That's
Yeah.
obviously why
Yeah.
that happened. And
No,
yeah,
that's true. But there is a wonderful balance between the action, the psychological effects behind it, and also that internal dynamics with the crew that just works so brilliantly in this. And you also have, in a way, those, although we don't really get to hear from them, you have those pictures of the crew on the ground, the technicians and all of that. And as they sort of look after, watch the planes as they disappear, and they sort of turn around and go, okay, that's our job done for now, at least for a little while longer, you know, until they come back and we need to start repairing stuff again. So the different teams, the different layers involved in just getting a mission started was just massive.
Yes, and you're absolutely right there because the film does it with all these beautiful short duration shots, and it never overloads the audience with techno babble or technical jargon. It's all just no, look, these guys are all doing something. And I love how they show a slightly different activity every time. So you've got the guys doing the fueling,
Yeah,
servicing the engines, loading the bombs. And again, no dialogue, no introduction. Very often they're just there as a backdrop.
yeah,
But they are there and it shows the effort and yeah, as you say, the physical and the logistical effort of just mounting a raid on
yeah,
one day in a very big war where you're having to do this a lot, and also the looks on their faces when
yeah,
the bombers come back, because a couple of them you can see they're counting just as
yeah,
avidly as the planes return, and it did make me realize, even as a youngster, just how emotionally invested these guys were in their planes
yeah,
coming home, and it's a peculiarity of the military hierarchy, I think, that a member of a bomber crew would not be able to have the same kind of a relationship with a member of the ground crew as he could with his crewmates on the bomber. But there's still this connection there. It's just different.
point.
And without spending too much time on it, or even again, impressively, there's no dialogue in there. It's just these guys expectantly watching. And of
Yeah,
course, the dog looking a bit
yeah.
sad as it pokes up and then lies down again.
I love that little detail that the dog recognizes the sound of the engine of the Memphis Belle, you know, so he doesn't really get up. He's just lying there as all the planes come in. And then when the Memphis Belle comes in, he,
Yes, that is amazing. Canines will always outperform us in the senses, and he certainly does.
yes. Oh, that's a very nice little detail. And then, of course, also the fact that when you do come back, a lot of things can still go wrong technically until you're actually back on the ground. You're not really safe, although you're over friendly territory, until you're back on the ground.
Yes, yes, and it's the tension they create at the end of the film is brilliant. It's funny where they take the damage where over the target where they first begin to lose fuel. I had a horrible feeling about that because the choice of Bremen as a target for this
Yeah,
film was at that time, it was right at the extreme range of the B-17s that were in service, and they don't tell you that,
yeah,
but you get the impression from the look on everyone's faces that it's, oh no,
yeah,
can't we bomb somewhere in France today instead? And and so yeah, any fuel loss is potentially catastrophic, and the effect it has right at the end when they're losing one engine after another, and Phil and Dennis goes like, "Can we fly on one engine?" So we're going to find out soon enough, and
I know. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and the landing gear. Oh, do you know?
yes. Oh,
I I remember in the cinema, I was on the edge of my seat because I did not know at that time whether it was going to be one of those films where they hit you psychologically by killing the entire crew. Because of course we have that terrible crash at the
yes,
beginning when
yeah,
another bomber comes in the same circumstances, and you go, "Oh no, are they going to sort of bookend it by having it happen twice?" And and until the moment the plane touched down, I was just going.
yeah, yeah. That is a brilliant piece of cinematography because you also you follow that wheel slowly as they just spin madly, and then finally just as he reaches that final little tick, okay, and he goes.
Oh.
Oh, that's a brilliant piece of way of keeping up the tension. But it did also show, for cinematic effect, it's very good. But it did also show that even though you had dropped your bombs, you're on your way home, you weren't safe yet.
No.
Really weren't safe until you hit the ground.
No, no, and the poor bomber formations would be pursued all the way back out, much as they'd had to fight their way back in. It was uh, because I imagine once you've dropped your bombs over your target, there's a feeling of relief because
Yeah,
these, really deadly pieces of ordnance are outside your plane now, so then
yeah,
you're not going to worry about accidental explosions or a hit from an anti-aircraft gun accidentally detonating your bombs. But part of you must really just want to slump because
yeah.
the mission is complete.
Yes.
But as you say, oh no, we still have several hours flying and we still
Yeah,
have to concentrate. It must have been exhausting just having to stay on it and
yeah.
get yourselves home. And of
The-
course, a moment's inattention could cost you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think, another dilemma the movie touches on is when something happens, is it actually safer to drop someone who has been hurt?
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
do you chance taking him with you back home? And that is just a dilemma you cannot put young boys or anybody in. But the fact that that discussion they have there, it's just,
Hmm.
what is actually safest to do? Should we drop him? Should we just put a parachute on him and push him out? Which happened, it did happen. And sometimes, yeah, maybe the result was good, and sometimes it might not have been, but that decision in that moment.
Yes, and it's great that the film acknowledged that ultimately it all comes back to poor Dennis Dearborn because we're in most decisions of that nature, the final say would be his. And I was really glad that they put in the film he's given that line, tell the men it's my decision.
Yes.
Even though you're the one proposing it, I've had to shoulder this burden as well. And yeah, I find it incredibly touching because they've already been put through so much. Some of them have begun to come apart at the seams emotionally. And for most of the film, the only one who seems to be cool as a cucumber is Val.
Yes.
And they give him that break moment where he has to admit to what the others that actually he isn't a doctor and he doesn't know what on earth he's doing.
No,
And
no. But he
uh,
does keep his cool, because he's kind of been given this now, that this is what you do. Now go do it.
yes, yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, and the dramatic effect where they just white out the scene and you don't know whether they have done it or not until a
No,
bit later. That's just cinema genius.
yes, that's really good. But it did happen, and there was, this is horrible to say, but there was a peculiar supply on the people on the ground as well, because I remember my granddad worked in a military arsenal in the northern bit of Jutland in Denmark, and during the war there was a pilot, a parachute coming down, not very far from where he was working, and of course, and then the person whoever jumped was dead already, but they brought him into the military arsenal because that's what they had to do. And the parachute, of course, was made of pure silk at the time. So it did provide them with a lot of very beautiful fabric, and they divided it between them, his team. He was sewing sort of, he was working in leather, and he was sewing sort of military saddles and parachutes equipment. And they divided that fabric between them, and he got home to my mum with a very beautiful little dress. He was 2 at the time, with a little dress made out of the finest silk from the parachute.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I have a picture of her wearing that, actually. And I remember thinking at the time when she told me that, that is just bizarre. You're sitting there in a dress, a little tiny little girl made in a dress made out of a parachute. But in a way, it also tells a story of how people kind of went by. You got something, it dropped from the sky. Why not make use of it? The guy's already dead. He's not using it. And it just, I think, tells the story of how people found ways of surviving in the middle of all this horrible nightmare. And Denmark, obviously wasn't bombed in the way that Germany was. But if you had been in Germany and that would have happened, you would have done the same, obviously.
Yes, and actually, I mean, nobody wants the prize for having endured the worst of aerial bombardment in World War II, but the German civilian population is definitely up there, especially as you had the two allied come rival services of the United States Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force bombing Germany like clockwork. So the Americans come in the day, the British come in the night, and there's just no let up, especially if you live in one of the main well, certainly one of the main industrial centers, because you know that even if they decide to take a break for a day or two, you do not have a week going by where you don't have an air raid coming in. You can't sleep in your own bed. Sometimes, if you're really unlucky, your house doesn't exist anymore. So you're
Yeah.
not getting sleep. Your food supplies are being interrupted. Those scary people from the local enforcement are telling you you've got to carry on and keep the nation's production going, but
Yeah.
you're not really getting much back for all of this, and it's a great tribute to them that they were able to carry on under such
Yeah.
harrowing circumstances, and really I think that stands for all the civilian populations that had to endure this really terrible form of warfare. Because I suppose one of the really horrific ironies is that this was touted as a way of finishing wars quickly.
Yes.
And in the end, all it did was make them even more horrible.
It just went on and on. It must have felt like forever. Uh,
Yeah,
and you're so right. That's such a good point. It just made them. It didn't make the war shorter. It just made them worse. It just made them even more horrible.
yeah,
And I'm guessing in circumstances like that, you find tiny ways of surviving, even if it's
yeah,
even in a time where everything was rationed, you got a piece of the most beautiful silk ever, you found made good use of it,
yeah,
whatever you could get your hands on, you just sort
yeah.
of survived.
Yeah, something that brings a bit of joy and color
Yes.
into life. You salvage what you can from the
Yeah.
awfulness of the situation.
Mm.
Yeah, it's funny actually. They say children, youngsters are very often the most resilient because they're a bit more adaptable than grown-ups are, and
Yeah.
probably a good thing too. Um,
But true. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Sorry, that took a very dark turn. I was just wondering if I could. This is the great problem when one strays into a
As I
film.
said, we mentioned the war. It will be dark.
We did mention the war, and it would be dark. Yes, indeed. But the numbers I find are the shocking thing as well, because
Yeah.
if you'd said to someone in the 1920s that, future air battles would be fought out between hundreds of aircraft at a time, sometimes even thousands, they would have gone, oh, that's a bit fanciful.
Yeah.
And yet just 2 decades later, it's because I'm glad the film quoted the numbers where they
Yes.
said, 250,000 aircraft involved in this huge
Yeah.
struggle for control, or call it aerial dominance, to use the word that they like to use. And and the bare numbers are shocking because when I look at the aircraft of the time, I mean, certainly the aircraft now and the aircraft of the time, the amount of human effort that
Yeah.
goes into the making and operating of these things, it's staggering just what it represents. And as you said earlier, the number of people and how hard they have to work just to get one squadron of 20 something planes into the air, and multiply that several times over for the whole of the 8th Air Force. It's a to put a positive spin on it, it's an awful lot of employment for an awful lot of people.
And you stand there counting the numbers coming back, it's no,
Yeah.
it's horrible. But as you also said, Andrew, there is a really good point in the contrast between that going on and at the same time people back home who knows very little and who so quickly loses interest. And we kind of do the same today, don't we? When we're being bombarded on newspaper headlines with war happening, after a while we just go, I really cannot, read any more headlines about what's going on in the world. And of course that's a coping mechanism as well. But it's a really, really good point, because after a while, we cannot look at bombed cities anymore. We need something else to keep our interest going.
Yes. And it's particularly true of nations, I find, that are not directly involved in a conflict. So although many people in the US were strongly emotionally invested in the war, people like Derringer are needed to keep that interest going, and to encourage them when their morale flags as well, because I think a great problem with free societies is that we do then as now there's an element of, you want a bit of gratification for your effort. So we've done this, we've committed to doing this. Why haven't the other guys surrendered yet?
Yes.
So, what do you mean we're going to have to make even more effort? Oh, come on.
Yeah. Yes. No, such a good point. Oh, Andrew, this is fantastic. I knew you would be good for this one. You're bringing some completely new perspectives into this one. What else do we need to touch upon on this movie, with this movie?
Well, I'd like to end on a positive note if I
Yes.
can, because we did touch on some very, very dark things. I suppose in a way, we kind of touched on her a bit, but really there are 11 main characters in this film, because, as you know, going by the way they speak about her and the way they treat her and the way she brings them home like a good
Yes.
mother should, it's the Memphis Belle herself.
Yes.
Who has no dialogue whatsoever. I'd be a bit worried if she did. But plays a very eloquent part
Yeah.
in the whole thing.
Yes. And
And
that is a brilliant piece of storytelling as well, that you have this very, very crowded, claustrophobic setting of a plane, where everything is unfolding.
yes, yes. And as you rightly said earlier, they reveal so much of how she works
Yeah.
and what it's like. With again, minimal dialogue, just the sight
Yeah.
of these poor guys. And none of these are fat people, they're not. Well, but once they've got all their in-flight kit on and all the other bits, and it's a massive plane, but it's also quite a tiny one in many important respects. And I think showing that, I'll call them an aerial community.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, that's a good
go,
phrase.
yeah, it and what their life was like. It's brilliantly done. And again, no technical nonsense, but everything important is touched on. The importance of oxygen at high altitude,
Yes.
the captain's warning that,
Yep.
watch out for frostbite, because that can be
Yep.
a thing as well.
Yep.
All the many hazards of their job, things you could and couldn't do. And when they're taking off, just the non-essential guys for the takeoff, they're all huddled in the waist of the plane, just sitting
Yep.
there trying to distract themselves. Most
Yes.
of them have cigarettes.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And you just think, oh, you poor guys.
Yeah. And also again, for dramatic effect, but when one of the engines catches fire, and the way they have to dive,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
and just how difficult it is to actually get it back up again. You don't just get it back up again. That
No.
requires the effort of both the pilots. So you do get a lot of knowledge about how this plane works without all the boring technical stuff. You're right.
Yeah, yeah, and thanks for bringing that scene up, because that is a really good scene too. Because yeah, how does one safely try to operate in a plane where that kind of thing could happen? Because I did love how the camera cuts to the other bits of the fuselage where everyone's sort of like hanging on as the
Yeah.
plane's nosediving. That must have been absolutely terrifying.
None of them at the back could do anything. They're just holding on,
No, yeah, just thinking,
Yeah.
leaving their stomach several thousand feet above.
Yes. So that was a brilliant scene as well. Oh, this is a fantastic movie, Andrew. Thank you for actually reminding me of it because I'd almost forgotten it. I remember loving it when I watched it, and I watched it a couple of times. And then I kind of forgot a bit about it for some years. So I hadn't watched it in a long time. And it was amazing, just as amazing as I remember it.
Oh, great. Well, I'm really glad to hear that. And it did occur to me when I was watching it again, just to remind myself that the timing's superb because not so long ago, Steven Spielberg's I think it was Spielberg, the Masters of the Air series
Oh, yeah.
has started streaming and of course that deals with exactly the same campaign. So very
Yeah.
modern reinterpretation, different characters, of
Yeah.
course, but I need to watch Masters of the Air because I've heard varying opinions of it, and I would love to see how it compares with
Yeah.
Memphis Belle as a portrayal of that particular campaign in the
Yeah.
Second World War. So that will be quite interesting. So you've timed this one very well, Jane. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it was your suggestion. So I'm so happy when I read your email and you're going Memphis Belle. Oh my God, yes, Memphis Belle. How could I forget about that one? This was brilliant. This was brilliant.
Oh,
And thanks,
likewise.
Andrew, for sharing your knowledge. And I think, should we hand over to people in the comments now?
I think we should. They've been extremely patient. They've listened to us say our piece. So guys, as always, please, put your thoughts down in the comments. When did you first see Memphis Belle? What did you think of it? Do you have a favorite character? Did you recognize a very young Sean Astin among the
Oh,
crew?
yes.
Because I almost missed him.
I also saw there was a young Eric Schultz, wasn't there?
There
And
was
his
a
red
yeah.
hair and oh, what's he called? The piano guy.
Oh.
Oh God, I've forgotten his name now. That's embarrassing.
So have I. I know who you mean, but yes.
But he's actually an amazing musician as well. Was in there. Yeah. Who else have we missed? We missed
Bad guy from the Titanic as Val.
Oh, yes.
I'm very sorry, sir. I can't remember your real name, but
You're so right. You're so right. Yeah. You guys will know. Remind us in the comments below. It's
yeah.
an absolute pleasure as always, Andrew.
Likewise, Jane. Likewise, always fantastic to spend time with you. You talking over movies and reliving the good old times. The
Yes.
stuff we really enjoyed watching. And yeah, I look forward to picking the next one. And as always, to all of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have your company, guys and gals. I'm sure. Sorry, and yeah, hopefully we'll hear from you. And we look forward to seeing you in the next
See
one.
you next time. Take care,
Take care,
everyone.
Jane. See you soon. And thank you again. It's been awesome.
And you, Andrew.